There is a very specific, deeply ingrained kind of exhaustion that comes with watching regression dramas in this current golden age of television. We have all seen the formula 100 times before. The protagonist is wronged, pushed to the absolute brink, meets a tragic end, and then wakes up in the past with a singular, burning desire for revenge. They manipulate, they scheme, they systematically destroy the lives of everyone who slighted them. And we, the audience, are supposed to cheer for their ruthless ascent to power. But every once in a while, a show comes along that takes that exact same foundational premise and completely shatters it, replacing the cold, calculating satisfaction of revenge with something so raw, so emotionally devastating, and so profoundly human that it leaves you staring at your screen long after the credits roll. That is exactly what happened to me with Taming My 5 Beast Husbands. Welcome back to Flick Flair, where we don't just watch the drama, we dissect the very soul of it. If you are new here and you appreciate deep, unfiltered, and passionately honest reviews, do me a massive favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. And I promise you, the conversations we have here are unlike anywhere else on the platform. Today, we are diving into the 2026 release that has completely taken over my brain. And just a quick heads up, we are going to be dealing with moderate spoilers. I'm not going to ruin the absolute jaw-dropping final for you, but we are going to talk about the heavy emotional beats, the character arcs, and the psychological twists. So if you are strictly going in blind, you might want to bookmark this and come back later. But if you have seen it, or if you just love a deep analytical breakdown of why a show works so well, pull up a chair. Because we need to talk about Luna, her 5 husbands, and the absolute masterpiece of storytelling that is this 7-day journey. To truly understand the brilliance of this series, we have to start by looking at the sheer emotional weight of Luna's first life. Because the show does not just give us a brief flashback and call it a day. The writers make us feel the suffocating, inescapable tragedy of her original timeline. When we are introduced to Luna in the opening moments, she is already dying. The betrayal at the hands of the 5 men she called her husbands is not just a plot device. It is a visceral, agonizing experience that the show portrays with a terrifying intimacy. We see the coldness in their eyes, the casual cruelty in their words, and the way they justify their actions as if she were nothing more than a political pawn or a temporary convenience. The way the show frames her death is incredibly claustrophobic. The camera pushes in tight on her face, the lighting drains away into sickly, pale shadows, and the sound design strips away all the ambient noise of the room until all you can hear is her ragged, failing breaths and the echoing, distorted voices of the men who swore to protect her. It is a masterclass in making the audience feel her profound isolation. She didn't just lose her life. She lost her reality, her trust, and her very sense of self. And when fate grants her that impossible second chance, when she wakes up gasping for air in her own bed, the relief is instantly overshadowed by the crushing, traumatic memory of how that life ended. This is not a triumphant awakening. This is a survivor waking up in the exact same house where she was murdered, surrounded by the very people who held the knife. The premise of a 7-day journey to sever every magical and emotional bond tying her to these 5 men is, on paper, a brilliant structural constraint. It gives the narrative an undeniable ticking clock momentum that keeps the pacing incredibly tight, but it also serves as a brilliant psychological pressure cooker. Luna isn't just trying to survive, she is on a strict, unforgiving deadline to dismantle her own soul. The magic system in this world dictates that these marital bonds are not just symbolic, they are literal, ethereal tethers that connect her life force to theirs. To sever them means to literally tear a piece of her own spirit away. And the show makes sure you feel every single tear. The physical toll it takes on her is depicted with a gruesome, beautiful honesty. We are talking about nosebleeds, tremors, moments where she literally collapses because the magical feedback of breaking a bond is so overwhelming. But it is the emotional toll that really gets you. Because as she goes about her days, interacting with these men who are currently, In this timeline, deeply in love with her and entirely unaware of the monsters they will become, the audience is forced to grapple with a massive moral dilemma. You are watching her look into the eyes of men who are treating her with genuine affection, knowing exactly how they will eventually destroy her. The cognitive dissonance is maddening, and the lead actress plays it with such a heartbreaking subtlety. You can see the exact moment her heart breaks a little bit more every time one of them smiles at her, because she knows that smile is a lie, or worse, she knows that it is real now, but it won't last. But just when you think you have the emotional landscape of the show completely mapped out, and you think you understand exactly who the villains and the victims are, the third day hits, and the entire foundation shifts beneath your feet. The show introduces a layer of psychological complexity to the husbands that completely recontextualizes their future betrayals. Because here is the thing about regression stories. We always assume that the people who wronged the protagonist in the first timeline are just inherently evil. But Taming My Five Beast Husbands asks a much more uncomfortable question. What if their betrayal wasn't born out of pure malice, but out of a twisted, corrupted sense of duty, love, or survival? The show forces us to look at the men not just as the architects of a doom, but as tragic figures in their own right, trapped in a political and magical system that demands they sacrifice their humanity to maintain their power. When Luna starts actively trying to sever the bonds, their reactions are not just anger or confusion. It is sheer, unadulterated panic. They can feel her pulling away. They can feel the tethers fraying, and the way the actors portray this desperation is nothing short of phenomenal. They go from being these composed, powerful, untouchable beast lords to absolutely unraveling, clinging to her, begging her to stop, entirely stripped of their pride. It is a fascinating reversal of the typical power dynamic in these kinds of harem fantasies. Usually, the male leads are the ones holding all the cards, and the female lead has to navigate their egos. Here, Luna holds the absolute power of life and death over their emotional stability, and she is wielding it like a scalpel. Let's talk about the visual language of the show, because the cinematography and art direction are doing so much heavy lifting to convey the internal states of the characters. In Luna's first life, the visual palette was heavily dominated by sterile, opulent golds, blinding whites, and cold, unforgiving blues. It looked beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. Everything was perfectly symmetrical, perfectly lit, and completely devoid of warmth. But in this second life, as Luna starts actively fighting against her fate, the visual language shifts dramatically. The color grading becomes much earthier, richer, and more textured. We get deep, visceral reds, muddy browns, and shadowy, flickering firelight. The camera work transitions from the smooth, detached, sweeping crane shots of the first timeline to a much more intimate, handheld, and sometimes shaky aesthetic when we are in Luna's perspective. It makes the world feel lived in, dangerous, and incredibly real. When she is having a panic attack because one of her husbands touches her shoulder unexpectedly, the camera literally closes in on her, the focal length compressing the background until the room feels like it is suffocating her. It is a brilliant use of cinematography to put the audience directly inside her trauma response. And the costume design deserves a massive shout-out because the evolution of her wardrobe perfectly mirrors her psychological journey. She starts the second life in the exact same restrictive, heavy, jewel-encrusted gowns she wore in the first life, looking like a beautiful, trapped bird. But as the days progress and she starts severing the bonds, she literally starts shading those layers. By day 5, she's in simple, practical, dark fabrics that allow her to move freely. It is a visual representation of her reclaiming her autonomy, and it is so satisfying to watch. Now, I know everyone online is calling the second husband the quiet, calculating strategist of the group, an irredeemable monster for what he did in the first timeline. But I actually want to play devil's advocate here and offer a slightly different perspective. The consensus is that his betrayal was the most unforgivable because he was the one who orchestrated the political coup that ultimately led to her death. He smiled at her while he signed the order that sealed her fate. But if you look closely at the subtle clues the show drops in the present timeline, there is a very strong argument to be made that his actions in the first life were actually a desperate, twisted attempt to protect her from a much worse fate. The lore of the beast realms establishes that if the human consort is not sacrificed during the celestial alignment, the entire magical barrier protecting the realms will collapse and millions will die. He didn't kill her out of malice. He killed her because he was backed into a corner by a magical system that demanded her blood. And the reason he's so utterly broken and remorseful in the second timeline isn't just because he feels guilty for killing his wife. It is because, in his regression memories, he realizes that he failed to find a loophole. He spent the entire second timeline frantically searching for an alternative to the sacrifice, driven mad by the knowledge of what he had to do. When you view his character through this lens, his obsessive, almost suffocating devotion to Luna in the present day isn't just romantic love. It is the frantic, terrified devotion of a man who knows he is destined to be her executioner. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it adds a layer of tragic inevitability to his character that makes him so much more compelling than just a one-dimensional villain. And this brings us to a question that I think the showrunners are deliberately avoiding answering until the very last episode. What happens if she actually succeeds? What happens if Luna severs all 5 bonds? The show spends so much time focusing on the immediate, visceral pain of the severance and the emotional fallout with the husbands that it almost glosses over the magical consequences for Luna herself. The tethers aren't just connecting her to them, they are anchoring her soul to the physical realm. As she cuts them, she isn't just becoming free, she is becoming untethered. We start seeing these subtle, terrifying hints of her fading. Her reflection in the mirror gets a little bit blurry. Her voice loses a fraction of its resonance. The physical world seems to just slightly reject her presence. It is a brilliant, terrifying metaphor for what trauma does to a person. In trying to cut away the pain and the people who hurt you, you risk cutting away your own connection to the world. You risk becoming a ghost in your own life. The show is asking us to consider the cost of absolute emotional self-preservation. Is it worth it to be completely free if it means you are entirely alone, fading away into nothingness? It is a profound philosophical question wrapped in a gorgeous, high fantasy romance. And the way the writers weave it into the plot without ever stopping the narrative to give us a lecture is just masterful storytelling. I'm not going to lie to you guys, episode 4 completely broke me. I was sitting in my editing bay at 2 in the morning, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and I just started crying. Not the cute, single-tear kind of crying, but the ugly, chest-heaving, breathless sobbing that you try to muffle into a pillow so you don't wake up the neighbors. The scene where Luna confronts the third husband, the wild, fiercely loyal warrior who was the first to turn his back on her in the original timeline, was just too much. In the first life, he abandoned her in the freezing wilderness, leaving her to be captured by their enemies because he chose to chase a military victory instead of saving his wife. But in this life, when she confronts him with the memories of that freezing, agonizing death, he doesn't get defensive. He doesn't make excuses. He just drops to his knees in the mud, takes her hands, and presses his forehead to her knuckles, weeping openly, begging for a forgiveness he knows he doesn't deserve. The acting in that scene is so raw, so stripped of all the usual dramatic artifice, that it feels like you're watching something incredibly private and deeply painful. The way his voice cracks, the way his shoulders shake, the absolute devastation in his eyes. It is a masterclass in vulnerability. And Luna's reaction is what really destroyed me. She doesn't yell. She doesn't slap him. She just looks down at him with this profound, empty exhaustion and softly says, "You were so cold that day." Just that. 4 words. The sheer weight of the grief and the physical memory of the freezing cold in those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. It is a testament to how incredibly well-written and beautifully performed this show is. Side note, can we just take a second to talk about the sheer logistical nightmare of writing 5 distinct romantic arcs that don't overlap into a messy, indistinguishable blob? Because the writer's room deserves a massive medal for this. Usually, in reverse harem or polyamorous dynamics in fiction, the male characters end up blending together. They all have the same personality, just with different hair colors and slightly different magical powers. But here, every single husband has a completely distinct voice, a completely distinct visual motive, and a completely distinct psychological profile. The first husband is the stoic, burdened alpha whose love language is protection and provision, but whose fatal flaw is his inability to communicate his emotional burdens. The second is the intellectual, manipulative strategist whose love language is acts of service and anticipation of needs, but whose fatal flaw is his treating people like chess pieces. The third is the passionate, impulsive warrior whose love language is physical touch and shared adrenaline, but whose fatal flaw is his blinding ambition. The fourth is the gentle, healing mystic whose love language is words of affirmation and emotional support, but whose fatal flaw is his cowardice and inability to confront harsh realities. And the fifth, the youngest, is the chaotic, fiercely independent rogue whose love language is quality time and shared secrets, but whose fatal flaw is his deep-seated jealousy and fear of abandonment. Giving each of them a dedicated day in the 7-day structure to explore their specific dynamic with Luna, their specific brand of toxicity in the first life, and their specific path to remorse in the second life is a monumental achievement in character writing. It makes the world feel incredibly rich and lived in, and it ensures that every confrontation feels entirely unique. But let's talk about the sound design and the musical score, because they're the unsung heroes of this entire production. The composer made a fascinating choice to eschew the typical sweeping, orchestral fantasy scores that usually accompany these kinds of epic bistromance dramas. Instead, the music is heavily driven by percussion, deep, resonant string instruments, and these haunting, almost discordant vocal chants that feel ancient and slightly unsettling. It grounds the magic in something primal and visceral. When the husbands are in their beast forms, the sound design shifts dramatically. We don't just hear roars, we hear the deep, sabbath rumble that you feel in your chest, the cracking of bones, the heavy, wet sounds of their breathing. It makes their beast sides feel genuinely dangerous, reminding the audience that beneath the handsome, brooding faces of these men are literal apex predators. And then there is the use of silence. The show is not afraid of dead air. In the moments immediately following a bond severance, the music completely drops out. The ambient noise fades. All you hear is the sound of Luna's ragged breathing and the literal snapping of the magical tether, which sounds like a thick, wet rope being pulled apart under immense tension. It is deeply uncomfortable to listen to, and it is absolutely perfect. It forces you to sit in the awkward, painful silence of the aftermath, making the emotional impact of the scene linger long after the music kicks back in. As we move into the 5th day of Luna's journey, the pacing of the show undergoes a brilliant, deliberate shift. The frantic, almost thriller-like momentum of the first few days slows down into a heavy, psychological slog. This is where the show really digs into the thematic core of what it means to tame someone. The title of the show is Taming My 5 Beast Husbands, and for the first half of the series, you are led to believe that it is Luna who is doing the taming. She's the one setting the boundaries, she's the one cutting the codes, she's the one forcing these powerful, dangerous men to confront their flaws and submit to her will. But as the psychological toll of the severances starts to weigh heavily on her, and as the men start to push back, not with violence, but with an overwhelming, suffocating wave of genuine, changed devotion, the dynamic flips. You start to realize that by forcing them to confront their past sins, by making them grovel, by making them pour out their souls to beg for her forgiveness, she is inadvertently letting them back into her heart. She is taming them, yes, but in the process, they are taming her. They are breaking down the walls of ice she built around her heart to survive the trauma of her first life. The tragedy of the fifth day is that Luna realizes she is falling in love with them all over again, and she is absolutely terrified of it. The lead actress plays this realization with such a beautiful, tragic desperation. You can see the war happening behind her eyes. She wants to be free, she wants to be safe, but she is also so incredibly lonely. And these men, despite their past sins, are looking at her right now with a love so pure and intense that it is blinding. This is where the show's exploration of forgiveness becomes incredibly nuanced and, frankly, a little bit controversial. The narrative does not take the easy route of saying, oh, they said sorry in this timeline, so everything is fine now. Luna actively wrestles with the unfairness of it all. She argues with herself. She argues with her confidence. She screams into her pillow in the middle of the night. How can she forgive them for things they haven't technically done yet, but she remembers vividly? Is it fair to punish them for the sins of a timeline that no longer exists? But conversely, is it fair to her to expect her to just forget the visceral, agonizing memory of a murder? The show validates both perspectives. It allows the husbands to be genuinely remorseful and to do the hard, grueling work of changing themselves. But it also allows Luna to remain angry, to remain hurt, and to refuse to forgive them just because they are being nice to her in the present. It is a remarkably mature approach to the concept of redemption. It acknowledges that trauma doesn't just vanish because the circumstances change, and that forgiveness is not a switch you can just flip. It is a long, painful, non-linear process. There is a scene in episode 6 where the fourth husband, the gentle mystic, finally loses his temper with her. He doesn't yell, but his voice gets this dangerous, quiet edge to it, and he tells her that he cannot keep living in the shadow of a ghost, that he cannot keep apologizing for a murder he hasn't committed yet. It is a massive turning point because it is the first time one of them sets a boundary with her. It forces Luna to realize that her quest for absolute emotional safety is actually becoming its own form of toxicity. She is using her trauma as a shield, but she is also using it as a weapon to keep them at a distance where they can never hurt her again. The cinematography during these psychological confrontations is just stunning. The director uses a lot of mirrors and reflective surfaces to visually represent the duality of the characters and the fractured nature of Luna's identity. There is a specific shot in the fifth husband's episode that I cannot get out of my head. Luna is standing in a dimly lit, opulent bathroom, washing the blood from her nose after a particularly brutal bond severance. The camera is positioned behind the mirror, looking through the glass at her reflection. But the reflection is slightly delayed. When she moves her hand, the reflection moves a fraction of a second later. It is such a subtle, almost subliminal visual cue, but it perfectly captures her disassociation. She is physically present in the room, but her mind, her soul, is still trapped in the moment of her death in the first timeline. She is haunting her own life. The lighting in this scene is incredibly cold, with harsh, fluorescent-style magical lights casting sharp, unflattering shadows on her face, making her look pale and sickly. It is a stark contrast to the warm, golden, candlelit scenes she shares with the husbands, visually reinforcing the idea that her quest for freedom is literally draining the life and color out of her world. It is these little visual details that elevate the show from a standard fantasy romance to a genuine piece of psychological art. And we have to talk about the world building, because the lore of the Beast Realms is incredibly rich and serves as a perfect backdrop for the themes of the story. The Beast Realms are not just a generic fantasy setting, they are a deeply stratified, politically volatile society where the human consorts are essentially high-status hostages. The magic system, which revolves around the binding of life forces, is a direct metaphor for the patriarchal structures of their society. The men, in their beast forms, possess raw, overwhelming physical power, but they rely on the human consorts to anchor that power, to give it focus and direction. It is a symbiotic relationship, but historically, it has been deeply unequal. The men take the power, the status, and the freedom, while the women give up their autonomy, their magic, and eventually their lives. Luna's regression and her subsequent quest to sever the bonds is not just a personal journey of healing, it is a radical, systemic rebellion. She is literally trying to dismantle the magical and social structures that have kept her people subjugated for centuries. The show does a fantastic job of weaving this macro-level political commentary into the micro-level intimate relationships of the characters. When the first husband tries to stop her from severing his bond, he isn't just trying to keep his wife, he is trying to maintain the political alliance that keeps his faction in power. The personal is always political in this show, and it gives every single argument, every single tear, and every single betrayal a much higher stakes than just, "they broke my heart." But here is where things get really dangerous, because the show starts playing with our expectations of the regression trope itself, turning the mirror back on the audience. We, the viewers, are complicit in Luna's journey. We want her to be free. We want her to sever the bonds. We want her to escape these toxic men. But as the series progresses, the show starts to subtly challenge our desire for her independence. It asks us to look at the alternative. If she severs all 5 bonds, she will be free, yes. But she will also be entirely alone in a world that views her as nothing more than a political commodity. She will have no protection, no magical anchor, and no real place in society. The show forces us to ask ourselves, is the freedom she is fighting for actually going to make her happy? Or is it just going to lead to a different kind of destruction? It is a brilliant subversion of the typical feminist narrative in these kinds of stories. Instead of just saying independence is always the answer, the show presents a much more complex, messy reality where independence comes with a massive, potentially fatal cost, and where interdependence, even with flawed, toxic people, might actually be the key to survival. It doesn't invalidate her desire for freedom, but it complicates it, making the final choice she has to make on the 7th day so much more agonizing. The supporting cast also deserves a massive amount of credit for fleshing out this world and providing a much-needed outside perspective on Luna's increasingly obsessive quest. Her handmaiden, Elara, is the emotional anchor of the show. She is the only one who knows about the regression, and she serves as the audience surrogate, voicing the concerns and the fears that we are thinking but not saying. Elara's character arc is incredibly poignant. She starts out as this fiercely loyal, almost blindly supportive friend, but as she watches Luna physically and mentally deteriorate from the severances, she starts to push back. There is a heartbreaking confrontation between them in episode 5 where Elara basically tells Luna that she is so focused on not dying again that she has forgotten how to actually live. It is a harsh truth, and the way the lead actress reacts to it, crumbling to the floor and just sobbing into Elara's lap, is one of the most raw, unguarded moments of acting I have seen all year. It breaks the illusion of the strong, determined protagonist and reveals the terrified, traumatized girl underneath. And the dynamic between Elara and the 5 husbands is also fascinating. They all treat her with a mix of suspicion and begrudging respect, because they know she is the only one who can reach Luna when she locks herself away. The scenes where the husbands are trying to subtly bribe or interrogate Elara to find out what Luna is planning add a nice layer of tension, and even some much-needed dark humor to the heavier episodes. Let's take a step back and look at the editing, because the way the show handles the transitions between the present timeline and Luna's traumatic flashbacks is incredibly sophisticated. They don't just use a simple fade or a wavy distortion effect. They use match cuts that are deeply unsettling. For example, in one scene, Luna is pouring a cup of hot tea in the present day. The camera focuses on the steam rising from the cup. The next shot is a flashback to her first life, but it is the smoke rising from the burning village where she was betrayed. The visual similarity is there, but the context is violently different, and it triggers a panic attack in the present timeline. It is a brilliant way to show how trauma infiltrates everyday life, how the mind takes mundane sensory inputs and twists them into reminders of past pain. The editing, pacing of these flashbacks is also perfectly calibrated. They start off as brief, subliminal flashes, just a fraction of a second of a bloody hand or a cold, dead eye. But as the 7 days progress and Luna's mental state deteriorates, the flashbacks get longer, more detailed, and more intrusive. They start bleeding into the present timeline, overlaying her vision during conversations with the husbands, making it incredibly difficult for her to distinguish between the men who love her now and the men who killed her then. It creates this incredibly claustrophobic, paranoid atmosphere that makes you feel exactly what Luna is feeling. You are never quite sure what is real and what is a memory, and that shared disorientation is a brilliant narrative tool. And we cannot ignore the sheer physical transformation of the actors when they are in their beast forms. The practical effects combined with the CGI are a massive step up from the usual rubber suits or fully digital creations we see in these budgets. The actors actually wear extensive prosthetics and motion capture rigs on set, which allows them to physically embody the weight, the posture, and the aggression of their beast halves. When the first husband shifts into his massive, dire-wolf-like form, you can see the physical strain on the actor's body, the way his muscles bulge and his spine curves. It makes the beast forms feel incredibly grounded and dangerous. And the way the show uses the beast forms to express emotions that the characters cannot say in their human forms is just gorgeous. There is a scene where Luna is having a breakdown, and the third husband, unable to comfort her with words because he knows she will reject his touch, shifts into his lion-like form and just curls his massive, heavy body around her, acting as a physical shield against the world. He doesn't try to pet her or force her to interact. He just provides his warmth and his weight, grounding her in the physical present. It is a stunning visual representation of his love language, and it is a moment of pure, unadulterated cinematic poetry. It shows that beneath the political maneuvering and the toxic first timeline betrayals, there is a profound, primal instinct to protect and cherish her that transcends their human flaws. As we approach the 6th day, the narrative tension reaches an almost unbearable crescendo. The magical backlash from the severances is causing literal earthquakes and storms across the beast realms. The sky turns a bruised, violent purple, and the magical ley lines are fracturing. The world itself is rejecting Luna's attempt to rewrite her fate. This is where the show fully embraces its high fantasy roots, delivering spectacular, large-scale visual effects sequences that are genuinely jaw-dropping. The sheer scale of the destruction, the crumbling of the ancient temples, the swirling vortexes of raw, uncontrolled magic, it is a visual feast. But the show never lets the spectacle overshadow the emotional core. Even as the sky is falling, the camera stays focused on the faces of the characters. The climax of the 6th day is not a massive battle. It is a quiet, devastating conversation between Luna and the 5th husband, the rogue, in the middle of a ragging magical storm. The wind is howling, the debris is flying, but the sound design drops out almost completely, leaving only their voices. He tells her that if she severs the final bond, she will die. Not from the magical backlash, but from the sheer emptiness of a life completely untethered. He begs her to let him anchor her, to let him be the one thing she doesn't have to fight. It is a massive subversion of the typical climax. Instead of a sword fight or a magical duel, the climax of the penultimate day is an emotional surrender. And the way the lead actress plays it, the way her defiance finally, completely breaks, is just masterful. She realizes that her quest for absolute independence is actually a quest for self-destruction, and she has to make a choice between her trauma and her survival. This brings us to the thematic resonance of the title itself, Taming My 5 Beast Husbands. We have talked a lot about how she tames them and how they tame her. But there's a third layer to this concept that the show reveals in the final stretch. The beasts are not just the husbands. The beasts are the trauma, the grief, the anger, and the fear that live inside Luna. Her first life ended because she was consumed by the beast of her own naivety and trust. Her second life is almost ending because she is being consumed by the beast of her own vengeance and need for control. The 7-day journey is not just about severing the bonds to the men. It is about severing the bonds to her own past trauma. It is about taming the beast inside herself that wants to burn the world down to feel safe. The husbands, in their own flawed, messy, desperate ways, are the ones helping her do it. They're the mirrors that reflect her pain back at her, forcing her to confront it, to process it, and eventually to let it go. It is a beautiful, profound message about the nature of healing. Healing is not a solitary journey. You cannot just cut away the pain and expect to be whole. You have to let people in, even if they have hurt you, even if they are flawed, because it is through connection, through vulnerability, and through the messy, complicated work of forgiveness that we actually tame the beasts inside us. The musical score during this realization is just breathtaking. The composer brings back the main theme from the first episode. But instead of the discordant, unsettling vocal chants, it is now played on a single, clear cello, accompanied by a soft, rising string section. It transforms the theme from a song of trauma and dread into a song of mourning and eventual acceptance. It is a musical representation of Luna finally integrating her past into her present, rather than trying to violently excise it. The way the music swells as she finally drops her defenses and allows the fifth husband to hold her in the middle of the storm is one of the most emotionally cathartic moments in television this year. It is a release of tension that has been building for 6 entire episodes, and it leaves you feeling completely drained, but in the most beautiful, satisfying way possible. You feel like you have gone through the storm right alongside her, and you have finally made it to the other side. But the story is not quite over. Because even though Luna has stopped the severances, even though she has chosen connection over isolation, the consequences of the first 5 days still stand. The bonds are fractured. The magical ley lines are still unstable. And the husbands, while relieved that she is not going to abandon them completely, are still carrying the massive, crushing guilt of their first timeline sins. The 7th day is not a neat, tidy bow on top of the package. It is a grueling, painful day of reckoning. It is the day where they all have to face the reality of what they did and what they have to do to make it right. The show does not give them a free pass just because they are sorry in this timeline. They have to earn their redemption, and the show makes them work for it. This is where the political and magical plot lines fully merge with the emotional ones. To stabilize the ley lines and heal the fractured bonds, the 5 husbands have to willingly submit to a ritual that will permanently bind their life forces to hers, not as masters to a consort, but as equals to a partner. They have to give up their absolute authority, their magical dominance, and their political leverage, and place it entirely in her hands. It is the ultimate act of submission, the ultimate proof of their remorse. And the way the show stages this ritual, with its ancient, solemn magic, its breathtaking visual effects, and its deeply emotional character moments, is a fitting, spectacular climax to the entire series. It is a visual and thematic culmination of the entire taming concept. They're not taming her, and she is not taming them. They are taming the system together, forging a new, equal partnership out of the ashes of the old, toxic one. The final scenes of the series are a masterclass in emotional restraint. After the spectacular, high-stakes ritual, the show strips everything back. No grand speeches, no sweeping orchestral scores, no massive crowd cheering. Just Luna and her 5 husbands sitting together in the quiet, early morning light of the newly stabilized beast realms. They are battered, they are exhausted, and they are fundamentally changed. The camera slowly pans across their faces, showing the subtle shifts in their expressions. The stoic alpha looks softer, the strategist looks less calculating, the warrior looks more at peace, the mystic looks more grounded, and the rogue looks less restless. And Luna, sitting in the center of them, looks truly, finally alive. The color grading in this final scene is gorgeous. It is not the sterile gold of her first life, and it is not the dark, earthy tones of a struggle. It is a warm, vibrant, sunrise palette full of soft pinks, gentle oranges, and clear, bright blues. It is the color of a new beginning. The final shot is just Luna's face, looking out at the horizon, and for the first time in the entire series, she smiles. Not a polite, political smile, not a forced, brave smile, but a genuine, small, quiet smile of someone who has survived the storm and is finally ready to see what the sun looks like. It is a perfect, deeply earned ending that respects the emotional journey of the characters and leaves the audience feeling incredibly hopeful. Taming My Five Beast Husbands is not just a great drama. It is a vital, necessary piece of storytelling that takes the tired tropes of the regression and reverse harem genres and injects them with profound psychological depth, stunning visual artistry, and a level of emotional honesty that is incredibly rare. It challenges its audience, it breaks your heart, and then it painstakingly, beautifully puts it back together. It is a show about the devastating cost of trauma, the complicated, non-linear nature of forgiveness, and the radical, terrifying act of choosing to love again after you have been destroyed. If you have not watched it yet, you are missing out on one of the most meticulously crafted, emotionally resonant dramas of the decade. It demands your attention, it rewards your patience, and it will stay with you long after the final credits roll. And that is all the time we have for this massive, deep dive review on Flick Flare. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please, I cannot stress it enough, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let me know in the comments which of the 5 husbands you are rooting for, or if you think Luna made the right choice in the end. I read every single comment, and I love discussing the nuances of these shows with you guys. Until next time, keep watching, keep analyzing, and keep flaying the fiction. Flaying the fiction. But to truly understand the magnitude of that final, hard-earned smile, we have to pull back the curtain and look at the massive, intricate, and frankly mind-bending lore that the showrunners built to support this emotional core. Because if we just call it a masterpiece of character study and leave it at that, we are doing a massive, unforgivable disservice to the world building that makes this 2026 release so utterly unique. The lore of the Beast Realms is not just window dressing, it is the fundamental engine that drives every single conflict, every single betrayal, and every single moment of redemption in the series. The concept of the celestial alignment, which I briefly touched on earlier, is actually rooted in a deeply fascinating piece of in-universe history that the show reveals gradually through environmental storytelling and fragmented dialogue. Hundreds of years before the events of the series, the Beast Realms were tearing themselves apart in a catastrophic civil war, driven by the raw, uncontrolled magical energy that naturally emanates from their beast forms. To prevent the complete annihilation of their world, the ancient beast lords forged a pact with the human kingdoms, creating the system of marital bonds. The human consorts were not originally intended to be subjugated. They were meant to be magical anchors, grounding the volatile beast energy and allowing the lords to rule with clarity and purpose. But over centuries, as the memory of the civil war faded into myth, the political dynamic shifted. The anchors became hostages, the symbiotic relationship became parasitic, and the consorts were reduced to little more than political pawns and magical batteries. This historical context completely recontextualizes Luna's journey. She isn't just fighting for her own personal freedom, she is inadvertently challenging a centuries-old, deeply entrenched systemic oppression. When she severs the bonds, she isn't just breaking a magical contract. She is disrupting the foundational power structure of the entire realm. The show does a brilliant job of making the audience feel the weight of this history without ever stopping the narrative to deliver a dry, encyclopedic lecture. We see it in the crumbling frescoes in the palace halls. We hear it in the hushed, reverent tones of the elders when they speak of the First Pact. And we feel it in the underlying tension of every political negotiation. Now, you might be thinking that with such a massive, complex political backdrop, the show would lose sight of the intimate, emotional relationships at its core. But that is where the genius of the writing really shines through, because every single macro-level political conflict is directly mirrored in the micro-level dynamics of Luna's relationships with her 5 husbands. Take the first husband, the alpha, and the undisputed leader of the beast realms. In the first timeline, his betrayal was rooted in his absolute, uncompromising dedication to the stability of the realm. He viewed Luna's sacrifice as a necessary, tragic duty, a mathematical equation where her life was the cost of doing business to maintain the magical barrier. But in the second timeline, as Luna starts actively pulling away, we get to see the crushing, suffocating weight of his leadership. There's a specific, incredibly tense scene in the 4th episode where he is presiding over the High Council. The camera is positioned low, looking up at him on his massive, obsidian throne, emphasizing his physical dominance and political authority. But the lighting is incredibly harsh, casting deep, shadowy hollows under his eyes, making him look exhausted, aged, and deeply burdened. The other council members are pressing him to secure the celestial alignment, subtly hinting that if he cannot control his consort, they will find another way to secure the magic. The way the actor plays this scene is just phenomenal. He doesn't yell, he doesn't slam his fist on the table. He just sits there, his jaw clenched so tight you can see the muscle ticking, his eyes darting between the council members with a cold, predatory calculation. He's a man trapped in a corner, realizing that his political power is entirely dependent on the very woman he is trying to protect, and the council knows it. When he finally dismisses the council, the moment the heavy oak doors close, his posture completely collapses. He slumps forward, burying his face in his hands, and lets out a breath that sounds like it's been trapped in his chest for a decade. It is a masterful deconstruction of the stoic, untouchable alpha male trope. The show strips away the glamour of his power and exposes the profound, isolating loneliness of his position. And when Luna confronts him later that night, knowing exactly what he is struggling with, her refusal to comfort him isn't just about her own trauma. It is a radical rejection of the system that demands she absorb his pain at the cost of her own life. But wait, it gets even more complicated when we look at the second husband, the strategist, because his arc in the second timeline is essentially a psychological thriller wrapped in a romance. If the alpha struggle is political, the strategist's struggle is entirely intellectual and moral. In the first life, he was the one who calculated the exact magical requirements for the sacrifice, the one who looked at Luna not as a wife, but as a variable in an equation. But in the second life, the guilt of that calculation is eating him alive. The show gives us these fascinating, almost voyeuristic glimpses into his study, a massive, circular room lined with towering bookshelves and covered in intricate, hand-drawn maps and astronomical charts. The production design here is incredibly detailed. You can see the margins of his notes are filled with frantic, overlapping calculations, crossed out and written, showing his desperate, obsessive search for a loophole to save her. There's a moment in episode 5 where Luna sneaks into his study while he is asleep. The camera follows her from behind, moving slowly through the dimly lit room, the only illumination coming from the dying embers in the fireplace and the pale moonlight filtering through the high, arched windows. She looks at his desk, at the sheer volume of work he has done, at the ink stains on his fingers, and she realizes that his insomnia, his coldness, his emotional distance in the present day isn't because he doesn't care. It's because he is working himself to the bone trying to outsmart a magical system that demands her death. The actor who plays the strategist has this incredible ability to convey a million thoughts behind his eyes without saying a single word. When he wakes up and catches her looking at his notes, the panic that flashes across his face is raw and unguarded. He immediately tries to cover the papers, his usual smooth, calculated demeanor shattering completely. He tries to play it off, to use his usual charm and manipulation. But Luna just looks at him with this profound, devastating pity. She sees right through him. She sees the terrified boy underneath the brilliant, ruthless politician. And that moment of being truly seen, of having his deepest, darkest secret laid bare, and met not with anger, but with pity, breaks him in a way that no physical battle ever could. It is a brilliant exploration of the idea that intellectual arrogance is often just a mask for deep-seated insecurity and fear. And speaking of fear and masks, we have to talk about the third husband, the warrior, because his character arc is the most physically visceral and the most emotionally explosive of the entire series. In the first timeline, his betrayal was the most brutal, the most immediate. He didn't scheme, he didn't calculate. He just chose the glory of the battlefield over the life of his wife, leaving her to die in the freezing wilderness. The physical memory of that cold, that absolute abandonment, is what haunts Luna the most in her day-to-day life. The show uses sensory details brilliantly to convey this. Whenever the warrior is near her, Luna's breath plumes in the air, even if they are in a warm, sunlit room. The sound design drops the ambient noise and replaces it with the howling of a bitter wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. It is a brilliant, terrifying use of subjective audio to put the audience directly inside her PTSD. But in the second timeline, the warrior is acutely aware of his own destructive nature. He's a man who knows he's a weapon, a man who knows that his instincts lean towards violence and conquest, and he's terrified of his own capacity for cruelty. The contrast between his life on the battlefield and his life with Luna is stark and beautifully depicted. The training yard scenes are shot with a chaotic, kinetic energy. The camera is handheld, shaking with the impact of every sword strike, the dust kicking up in thick clouds, the sound of metal clashing ringing out deafeningly. He's a force of nature, covered in sweat and blood, his eyes wild with the thrill of combat. But the moment he sees Luna approaching the edge of the yard, the transformation is instantaneous and heartbreaking. He drops his weapon, the wildness drains from his eyes, and he practically shrinks in on himself, suddenly hyper-aware of the blood on his hands, the dirt on his face, the monster he just was. He tries to keep his distance, literally backing away from her, terrified that his beast nature will somehow infect her, that he will hurt her just by being near her. There is a specific scene in episode 6 where he is patching up a wound from a sparring session, and Luna walks in. He immediately tries to hide his arm, to turn away, but she steps into his space, takes the bandage from his hands, and starts wrapping his wound herself. The way he flinches at her touch, not out of pain, but out of a desperate, overwhelming fear of hurting her, is just devastating. He's a giant of a man capable of tearing through a battlefield, but he's trembling like a leaf under her gentle hands. It is a profound commentary on the nature of toxic masculinity and the pressure men face to suppress their vulnerability, showing that true strength isn't about never feeling fear, but about having the courage to let someone see your fragility. Now, I know a lot of viewers found the fourth husband, the Mystic, to be the most frustrating character in the first half of the series, and I completely understand why. In the first timeline, his betrayal was the most insidious because it was born out of cowardice. He was the healer, the one who was supposed to nurture and protect, but when the political pressure mounted, he simply looked the other way. He chose his own comfort and his position in the temple over her life. He didn't actively kill her, he just let her die. And that passive betrayal is often so much harder to forgive than active malice. But the show does something incredibly brave with his character in the second timeline. It doesn't just make him overly apologetic, it forces him to confront his own profound spiritual emptiness. The mystic's magic is tied to the spiritual realm, to the flow of life energy. But because he severed his connection to Luna in the first life, his magic in the second life is hollow, performative, and ultimately useless. The temple scenes are visually stunning, filled with swirling incense, glowing crystals, and chanting monks, but the camera work makes the space feel incredibly cold and sterile. It looks like a place of worship, but it feels like a mausoleum. The actor playing the mystic has this ethereal, almost detached quality to his performance in the early episodes, which perfectly reflects his spiritual disconnection. But as Luna starts severing the bonds, the magical feedback starts to physically affect him. Because he is the healer, he's the most sensitive to the disruption of the life tethers. He starts experiencing phantom pains, feeling the exact moments of a trauma as if they were his own. This is where his character arc shifts from frustrating to deeply tragic. He is literally being forced to feel the pain he ignored in the first life. There is a scene in the 5th episode where he collapses in the middle of a healing ritual, clutching his chest, gasping for air, because Luna is currently having a panic attack in her chambers. The monks rush to help him, but he waves them off, tears streaming down his face, because he knows exactly what is causing the pain. He crawls out of the temple, ignoring the protests of the elders, and physically drags himself across the palace grounds to her door. When she finally opens it, he doesn't say a word. He just falls at her feet, pressing his hands to the ground, begging the earth itself to forgive him for his past cowardice. It is a moment of profound spiritual breaking, a complete shattering of his ego and his false piety. The show is making a powerful statement here about the difference between performative goodness and actual moral courage, and how true healing requires you to confront the ugly, uncomfortable truths you've been running from. But here is where the narrative really throws us a curveball. Because just as we think we have the emotional landscape of all 5 husbands completely mapped out, the 5th husband, the rogue, steps into the spotlight and completely flips the power dynamic on its head. The rogue is the youngest, the most chaotic, the most fiercely independent. In the first timeline, his betrayal was the most personal. He was the one she loved the most, the one she thought understood her desire for freedom. But when the time came to choose between his own liberty and her life, he chose himself. He ran. He abandoned her to save his own skin. The psychological damage of that betrayal is the core of Luna's regression. She didn't just lose her life. She lost her belief in the possibility of unconditional love. But in the second timeline, the rogue's arc is a fascinating exploration of guilt and the desperate need for redemption. He knows he is a coward. He knows he ran. And instead of trying to overcompensate with grand, sweeping gestures of protection like the alpha or the warrior, his path to redemption is incredibly grounded, incredibly intimate, and incredibly dangerous. He becomes her shadow. He uses his skills in stealth, infiltration, and subterfuge to actively dismantle the political machinations that led to her death in the first life. While the other husbands are fighting the overt, political battles, the rogue is in the shadows, poisoning the wine of the corrupt nobles, stealing the ledgers that prove the council's treason, and silently eliminating the threats before they even materialize. The scenes featuring the rogue are shot with a completely different visual style. The camera is constantly moving, tracking him through the dark, narrow corridors of the palace, across the slippery, moonlit rooftops, and through the bustling, chaotic underground markets. The lighting is low, relying heavily on practical sources like flickering torches, glowing magical runes, and the pale light of the moon. It gives his storyline a gritty, almost Gnaw-like feel that contrasts sharply with the opulent, high-fantasy aesthetic of the rest of the show. There is a specific sequence in episode 6 where he has to infiltrate the heavily guarded archives to steal the original text of the first pact. The tension in this scene is palpable. The sound design is incredibly stripped back. All you can hear is the soft pad of his bare feet on the stone floor, the rustle of his dark clothing, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the guards. When he is almost caught, the way he uses his beast form, shifting into a sleek, shadowy panther to blend into the darkness and slip past the guards, is a brilliant use of the show's magic system. It's not just about raw power. It's about agility, stealth, and using the environment to his advantage. But the most powerful moment of his arc isn't an action sequence. It's a quiet, devastating conversation he has with Luna on the roof of the highest tower in the palace. He confesses everything to her. He doesn't make excuses. He just lays his covered eyes bare, telling her that he ran because he was terrified, that he has spent every second of the second life trying to be brave enough to stay, but he still feels like a fraud. And Luna's response is what truly cements their relationship. She doesn't forgive him immediately, but she reaches out and takes his hand, telling him that running away is easy, but staying and facing the consequences is the hardest thing in the world, and she is proud of him for trying. It is a moment of profound, quiet intimacy that speaks volumes about the nature of forgiveness and the messy, non-linear process of healing. Now, let's talk about the visual representation of the magic itself, because the visual effects team deserves a massive amount of credit for how they handled the soul tethers. In a lot of fantasy shows, magic is just flashy lights and explosions. But here, the magic is deeply organic, deeply visceral, and deeply tied to the emotional state of the characters. The soul tethers are depicted as these glowing, ethereal cords of light that connect the chests of the husbands to Luna. But they aren't just simple lines of light. They are complex, pulsing, living things. The color of the tethers changes based on the emotional resonance of the relationship. When the relationship is healthy and balanced, the tethers glow with a warm, steady, golden light. But when there's tension, trauma, or deceit, the light flickers, dims, or takes on a sickly, bruised purple hue. And when Luna actively starts severing them, the visual effects are nothing short of spectacular and deeply unsettling. The tethers don't just snap. They fray, they spark, they bleed a dark, smoky residue into the air. The physical toll on Luna is depicted with a gruesome, beautiful honesty. We see the magical feedback traveling up the tether, hitting her chest, and causing her to literally cough up black, smoky blood. It is a brilliant visual metaphor for the idea that cutting away toxic connections doesn't just make you free. It leaves a mess, it leaves a wound, and it takes a physical toll on your body. The VFX team used a combination of practical effects, like the blood and the sweat, and subtle, integrated CGI for the magical elements, which grounds the magic in reality and makes it feel like a tangible, physical force rather than just a computer-generated afterthought. The way the light from the tethers interacts with the environment, casting soft, glowing reflections on the characters' faces and the surrounding architecture, adds a layer of visual depth that makes every magical scene feel incredibly immersive and real. And speaking of visual depth, we have to talk about the cinematography and the specific camera lenses the director chose to use for this series, because the visual language of the show is doing so much heavy lifting to convey the internal states of the characters. The director made a very deliberate choice to shoot the present-day timeline using anamorphic lenses, which give the image a slightly wider, more cinematic aspect ratio, and create those beautiful, horizontal lens flares when the light hits the glass. But more importantly, anamorphic lenses have a very shallow depth of field, which means the background is often beautifully blurred, throwing the characters into sharp, isolated focus. This perfectly captures Luna's psychological state. She is so hyper-focused on her trauma, so locked into her own internal world, that the rest of the world literally blurs out around her. But when we transition into the flashbacks of her first life, the director switches to spherical lenses. The image becomes slightly softer, the edges of the frame are less distorted, and the depth of field is deeper, allowing us to see the entire environment, the entire context of her betrayal. It is a subtle, almost subliminal visual cue that tells the audience we are no longer in Luna's hyper-focused, traumatized present, but in the broader, more objective reality of her past. The lighting in these flashbacks is also drastically different. The present day is lit with warm, practical lights, lots of firelight, candlelight, and soft, diffused sunlight. It feels intimate, lived in, and human. But the flashbacks are lit with harsh, cold, overhead lighting, creating deep, unforgiving shadows that make the characters look almost demonic, emphasizing the horror of what they did to her. The contrast between the two visual styles is jarring in the best possible way, constantly reminding the audience of the massive gulf between the men who love her now and the men who killed her then. But let's pivot for a second and look at the costume design, because the wardrobe in this show is a masterclass in visual storytelling and character evolution. I mentioned earlier how Luna's wardrobe shifts from restrictive, heavy gowns to simpler, practical fabrics. But the evolution of the husband's clothing is just as significant, if not more so. In the first few episodes, the husbands are dressed in the traditional, opulent attire of the beast lords. Think heavy velvets, intricate metallic embroidery, high collars, and layers of ceremonial armor that literally weigh them down. It is clothing designed to project power, authority, and untouchability. But as the series progresses and they start to break down their own egos, their clothing starts to physically lighten. The alpha sheds his heavy ceremonial pauldrons, opting for simpler, darker tunics that allow him to move more freely. The strategist stops wearing the high, restrictive collars that frame his face like a cage and starts wearing softer, open-necked shirts. The warrior stops wearing the polished, decorative armor and starts wearing the worn, practical leathers of a soldier. The mystic trades his heavy, jewel-encrusted robes for simple, unadorned linen. And the rogue, who is always dressed for movement, starts wearing darker, more subdued colors, blending into the shadows rather than standing out. This visual shading of their armor and their opulence perfectly mirrors their psychological journey. They are stripping away the performative aspects of their power, the societal expectations of what a beast lord should look like, and getting down to their raw, authentic selves. And the use of color is incredibly deliberate. The alpha is associated with deep, royal blues and blacks, representing his authority and his shadow. The strategist is associated with cool silvers and grays, representing his intellect and his detachment. The warrior is associated with fiery reds and burnt oranges, representing his passion and his violence. The mystic is associated with pure whites and pale golds, representing his spirituality and his false purity. And the rogue is associated with deep greens and shadows, representing his connection to the wild and his hidden nature. As they evolve, these colors soften, blending together, visually representing the breaking down of their rigid, isolated identities and the forging of a more unified, balanced partnership with Luna. Now, I want to take a step back and talk about the set design and the architecture of the Beast Realms, because the physical spaces in this show are incredibly evocative and deeply tied to the themes of the narrative. The palace itself is a character in its own right. It is a massive, sprawling complex of dark stone, towering spires, and intricate Gothic arches. It is beautiful, but it is also incredibly imposing, designed to make anyone walking through its halls feel small, insignificant, and entirely at the mercy of the lords who rule it. The corridors are long, dimly lit, and echoing, emphasizing the isolation and the distance between the characters. Luna's chambers, in particular, are a masterclass in environmental storytelling. In the first timeline, her rooms were decorated in the sterile, opulent style of the High Court, filled with heavy drapes, gilded furniture, and cold, marble floors. It looked like a beautiful cage. But in the second timeline, as she starts to reclaim her agency, she starts physically altering her space. She opens the heavy drapes to let the light in. She replaces the cold marble floors with warm, woven rugs. She brings in plants, bringing life and color into the sterile space. The camera work in her rooms shifts accordingly. In the early episodes, the camera is often positioned high up, looking down on her, emphasizing her entrapment and her smallness in the grand scheme of the palace. But as she reclaims her space, the camera drops to her eye level, making the room feel more intimate, more grounded, and more hers. It is a brilliant use of set design and camera placement to visually represent her psychological journey from a trapped, powerless consort to an empowered, autonomous woman. and the contrast between the opulent, suffocating palace and the wild, untamed territories outside the palace walls is stark and beautifully realized. The outdoor scenes are shot on location in breathtaking, rugged landscapes with sweeping, panoramic shots that emphasize the vastness and the danger of the world. It is a visual reminder of what Luna is fighting for, what she is risking everything to experience. The simple, terrifying, beautiful freedom of the open world. And we cannot ignore the sound design and the Foley work, because the audio landscape of this show is incredibly rich, detailed, and deeply immersive. The sound team made a fascinating choice to ground the magical elements in very real, very physical sounds. When a husband shifts into his beast form, we don't just hear a magical zap or a generic roar. We hear the deep, visceral sounds of biology changing. We hear the cracking of bones, the tearing of muscle, the heavy, wet sounds of breathing, the clicking of claws on stone. It makes the beast forms feel incredibly real, incredibly dangerous, and deeply connected to the physical world. And the ambient noise of the palace is also incredibly detailed. You can hear the distant, echoing footsteps of the guards, the low, murmuring conversations of the courtiers, the crackling of the fires in the hearths, the howling of the wind against the high stone walls. It creates a sense of place, a sense that this world exists outside the frame of the camera, that life is happening all around the characters. But the most brilliant use of sound is in the moments of silence. The show is not afraid of dead air. In the moments immediately following a bond severance, or in the tense, quiet moments between Luna and the husbands, the ambient noise completely drops out. The music fades. All you can hear is the sound of their breathing, the rustle of their clothing, the subtle shifts of their weight. It is deeply uncomfortable to listen to, and it is absolutely perfect. It forces you to sit in the awkward, painful silence of the aftermath, making the emotional impact of the scene linger long after the sound kicks back in. It is a masterful use of audio to manipulate the audience's emotional state, drawing us so deeply into the characters' internal experiences that we feel their discomfort, their tension, and their relief as if it were our own. But let's talk about the musical score, because the composer created a soundscape that is just as complex, layered, and emotionally resonant as the narrative itself. I mentioned earlier the use of percussion, deep strings, and haunting vocal chants, but the specific thematic choices for each husband are just brilliant. The Alpha's theme is driven by deep, resonant brass and heavy, marching percussion. It is powerful, authoritative, and slightly intimidating, perfectly capturing his burden of leadership and his imposing presence. But as his character softens, the brass is gradually replaced by warmer, more melodic string arrangements, reflecting the thawing of his cold, stoic exterior. The strategist's theme is entirely different. It is built around intricate, interwoven woodwind melodies and the sharp, precise plucking of a harp or a lute. It is intellectual, calculating, and slightly detached, reflecting his analytical mind. But when he finally breaks down and confronts his guilt, the theme shifts into a minor key, the intricate melodies collapsing into a single, mournful cello line, representing the shattering of his intellectual defenses. The warrior's theme is all driving, kinetic energy, built around fast-paced, tribal drums and the aggressive, sweeping strokes of a violin. It is passionate, violent, and untamed, reflecting his life on the battlefield. But in his quiet moments with Luna, the drums fade away, leaving only a soft, acoustic guitar melody representing the gentle, vulnerable side of his nature that he hides from the world. The mystic's theme is ethereal and atmospheric, built around the haunting, echoing sounds of a glass harmonica and the soft, reverent chanting of a choir. It is spiritual, detached, and slightly unsettling, reflecting his connection to the spiritual realm and his false piety. But as he confronts his cowardice and starts to truly heal, the choir fades, replaced by the warm, resonant sound of a wooden flute, grounding his spirituality in the physical, human world. And the Rogue's theme is the most unique of all. It is built around the syncopated, unpredictable rhythms of a sitar and the low, sliding notes of a fretless bass. It is chaotic, playful, and slightly dangerous, perfectly capturing his unpredictable nature and his life in the shadows. But when he finally commits to staying, the chaotic rhythms smooth out into a steady, driving beat, representing his newfound stability and his commitment to Luna. The way these individual themes interact and blend together in the ensemble pieces, especially during the final ritual, is a musical representation of the characters finding their balance, their individual melodies weaving together to create a complex, beautiful, and harmonious whole. It is a masterful use of music to enhance the narrative and deepen the emotional impact of the story. Now, I want to take a moment to really dig into the acting, because the performances in this show are nothing short of extraordinary, and they're the primary reason the emotional beats land with such devastating impact. Let's start with the lead actress, because carrying a show of this magnitude, especially one with such a complex, nonlinear narrative and such heavy emotional requirements, is a monumental task. She has to play two versions of the same character, the naive, trusting, ultimately doomed woman of the first timeline, and the traumatized, hardened, fiercely determined survivor of the second timeline. And she has to do it while constantly flashing between the two internal states, often within the same scene. Her micro-expressions are a masterclass in subtle acting. There is a scene in the third episode where the Alpha is giving a speech to the court, and she is standing beside him. On the surface, she is the picture of the perfect, supportive consort, smiling politely, nodding at the appropriate moments. But if you look closely at her eyes, you can see the exact moment a memory of his first timeline betrayal flashes through her mind. Her pupils dilate slightly, her breathing hitches for a fraction of a second, and her smile doesn't reach her eyes, becoming fixed and brittle. It is a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, but it conveys a universe of internal pain and trauma. And her physical transformation over the course of the series is equally impressive. In the early episodes, her body language is closed off, defensive. She keeps her arms crossed, her shoulders hunched, her gaze lowered. She takes up as little space as possible, visually representing her desire to remain invisible and safe. But as she starts severing the bonds and reclaiming her agency, her posture changes. She stands taller, her shoulders roll back, her chin lifts, and she starts making direct, unflinching eye contact with the husbands. She starts taking up space, visually representing her growing confidence and her refusal to be marginalized any longer. It is a brilliant, physical manifestation of a psychological journey, and the actress executes it with such natural, effortless grace that it never feels forced or melodramatic. And the 5 male leads are equally phenomenal, each bringing a unique energy and a distinct acting style to their roles, while still maintaining a cohesive ensemble chemistry. The actor playing the Alpha has this incredible physical presence. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and moves with a slow, deliberate grace that commands attention the moment he enters a room. But his real strength lies in his ability to convey deep, repressed emotion through his body language. He doesn't need to yell to be intimidating, he just needs to look at you. And when he finally breaks down, the contrast between his usual stoicism and his raw, unguarded vulnerability is staggering. The actor playing the strategist relies heavily on his eyes and his voice. His face is incredibly expressive, capable of shifting from cold, calculating detachment to warm, genuine affection in the blink of an eye. His voice is a rich, smooth baritone that he uses like a weapon, modulating his tone to manipulate, to soothe, or to intimidate. But in his moments of true emotional honesty, his voice cracks, losing its polished veneer and revealing the terrified, guilty man underneath. The actor playing the warrior is a physical powerhouse. His performance is incredibly kinetic, full of restless energy and explosive emotion. He moves like a coiled spring, always ready to snap into action. But his scenes with Luna require an incredible amount of restraint. He has to play a man who is terrified of his own strength, and the way he physically holds himself back, the way he carefully controls his movements to avoid hurting her, is a masterful display of physical acting. The actor playing the mystic brings a quiet, ethereal quality to his performance. He moves softly, speaks softly, and has this calming, almost hypnotic presence. But his arc requires him to shed that calm, detached exterior and confront the ugly, chaotic reality of his own cowardice. The moment he finally loses his temper, the moment his voice rises and his calm facade shatters, is one of the most shocking and satisfying moments of the series. And the actor playing the rogue is the wild card of the group. He is charming, unpredictable, and incredibly charismatic. He has a natural, easygoing swagger that makes him instantly likable, but he also has this underlying darkness, a shadow in his eyes that hints at his deeper insecurities and his past failures. His chemistry with the lead actress is electric, full of a playful, bantering energy that slowly deepens into a profound, quiet intimacy as the series progresses. The ensemble works so well together because they all understand that they are not just playing individual characters. They are playing parts of a single, fractured whole, and their interactions are filled with a complex, layered history that feels incredibly real and lived in. But let's talk about the directing and the pacing, because managing a narrative with 5 distinct romantic arcs, a complex political backdrop, a high fantasy magic system, and a non-linear, time-bending structure is a logistical nightmare, and the director handles it with absolute brilliance. The pacing of the 7-day structure is incredibly tight, but the director never lets the ticking clock momentum overshadow the character development. Each day is given its own distinct visual and thematic identity, allowing the audience to fully immerse themselves in the specific dynamic between Luna and the husband of the day before moving on to the next. The transitions between the days are handled beautifully, often using a visual motif like the rising or setting of the sun or the changing of the light in Luna's chambers to signal the passage of time. And the handling of the flashbacks is where the director really shines. As I mentioned earlier, the flashbacks are not just simple cutaways. They are deeply integrated into the present-day narrative, often triggered by sensory inputs in the present. The director uses a variety of techniques to blend the past and the present, from match cuts and overlapping audio to literal visual overlays, where the ghosts of the first timeline bleed into the reality of the second. It creates a deeply disorienting, claustrophobic atmosphere that perfectly captures Luna's psychological state. And the action sequences are directed with a clear, coherent spatial geography. The camera is never so shaky or the editing so fast that you lose track of where the characters are or what is happening. The director understands that the action is not just about spectacle. It is about character. Every sword strike, every magical blast, every beast transformation is driven by the emotional state of the characters involved, making the action feel meaningful and impactful rather than just gratuitous. The climax of the series, the ritual of the celestial alignment, is a masterful blend of spectacular visual effects, intense emotional performances, and intricate magical choreography. It is a sequence that demands your full attention, and it rewards that attention with a deeply satisfying, emotionally resonant payoff that ties together all the thematic and narrative threads of the series. Now, I want to dive a little deeper into the thematic resonance of the show, specifically its exploration of trauma, memory, and the ethics of regression. The concept of regression, of going back in time to fix your mistakes, is a hugely popular trope in modern fiction, and it is often used as a simple power fantasy. The protagonist gets a do-over. They use their future knowledge to get rich, to get revenge, to get the perfect romantic ending. But Taming My 5 Beast Husbands asks a much more uncomfortable, much more profound question. What is the actual psychological cost of carrying the memories of a traumatic death into a new timeline? The show argues that trauma doesn't just vanish because the circumstances change. Luna has the memories of a murder, the visceral, agonizing experience of her betrayal, and those memories are just as real, just as painful in the second timeline as they were in the first. The show validates her pain, it validates her anger, and it refuses to take the easy route of having her just forgive the husbands because they are being nice to her in the present. It acknowledges that forgiveness is not a switch you can just flip. It is a long, painful, non-linear process. And it also explores the ethical dilemma of the husbands. They are being punished, in a way, for sins they haven't committed yet. They are carrying the guilt of a timeline that no longer exists, and they are trying to atone for actions they haven't actually taken. The show doesn't offer easy answers to this dilemma. It doesn't say that Luna is right to hold on to her anger, and it doesn't say that the husbands are wrong to beg for forgiveness. It just presents the messy, complicated reality of the situation and allows the audience to grapple with the moral ambiguity. It is a remarkably mature, nuanced approach to the concept of redemption, and it elevates the show far above the typical regression fantasy. It asks us to consider the nature of identity and memory. Are we defined by our actions or by our intentions? If a person commits a terrible act in one timeline, but genuinely repents and changes in another, are they still the same person? The show doesn't give us a neat, tidy answer, but it forces us to ask the question, and that is the mark of truly great storytelling. And this brings us to the thematic exploration of power and agency, and the show's brilliant subversion of the reverse harem genre. Traditionally, the reverse harem or polyamorous dynamics in fiction are heavily focused on the female protagonist being the center of attention, being desired, being protected by multiple powerful men. It is often a fantasy of being loved and valued, but it can also reinforce traditional gender dynamics where the women are passive recipients of the man's affection and protection. But this show completely flips that dynamic. Luna is not a passive recipient. She is the active agent of her own destiny. She's the one setting the boundaries. She's the one cutting the codes. She's the one forcing these powerful, dangerous men to confront their flaws and submit to her will. She holds the absolute power of life and death over their emotional stability, and she wields it with a terrifying, uncompromising resolve. The show is a profound exploration of female agency, of a woman taking control of her own narrative, her own body, and her own magic in a world that has historically sought to control and subjugate her. But it also explores the cost of that agency. As I mentioned earlier, her quest for absolute emotional safety and independence comes with a massive, potentially fatal cost. She is literally fading away, becoming untethered from the physical world. The show is asking us to consider the balance between independence and interdependence. Is it worth it to be completely free if it means you are entirely alone? The show argues that true power doesn't come from isolating yourself and cutting away all your connections. It comes from having the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to love, even when you know you could be hurt. It is a profound, feminist critique of the idea that empowerment means having to be invulnerable. True empowerment, the show argues, is having the strength to be vulnerable, to let people in, to build connections, even when it is terrifying. And that is a message that resonates deeply, not just within the context of the fantasy genre, but in the real world as well. But let's talk about the cultural impact of the show, because since its release in 2026, it has completely taken over the cultural conversation. The fandom is massive, incredibly passionate, and deeply engaged in analyzing every single detail of the show. The online discussions, the fan theories, the video essays, the fan art, the fan fiction, it is a cultural phenomenon on a scale that we haven't seen in the fantasy romance genre in years. The fans have latched onto the complex psychological themes, the intricate world building, and the deeply flawed, deeply human characters, and they have run with it. There are endless debates about which husband Luna should have ended up with, about the ethics of her regression, about the political machinations of the beast realms, about the hidden meanings in the visual symbolism. And the showrunners have been incredibly engaged with the fandom, dropping subtle hints, confirming fan theories, and encouraging the deep, analytical approach that the fans are taking. It is a beautiful, symbiotic relationship between the creators and the audience, and it is a testament to the quality of the writing and the depth of the world they have created. The show has also sparked a much broader conversation about the tropes of the regression and reverse harem genres, challenging creators to think more deeply about the psychological and emotional realities of these narratives, and pushing the boundaries of what these genres can achieve. It has proven that fantasy romance doesn't have to be lightweight, escapist fluff. It can be a vehicle for exploring profound, complex, and deeply human themes. It has raised the bar for the entire genre, and it will be fascinating to see how other creators respond to the challenge it has set. And as we look at the legacy of Taming My Five Beast Husbands, it is clear that it is going to be remembered as a landmark achievement in television storytelling. It is a show that took the familiar, well-worn tropes of the regression and reverse harem genres and injected them with a level of psychological depth, emotional honesty, and visual artistry that is incredibly rare. It challenged its audience, it broke their hearts, and then it painstakingly, beautifully put them back together. It is a show about the devastating cost of trauma, the complicated, non-linear nature of forgiveness, and the radical, terrifying act of choosing to love again after you have been destroyed. It is a show that asks us to look at the monsters we create, the systems we build, and the walls we put up to protect ourselves. And it asks us if those walls are actually keeping the pain out, or if they are just keeping us trapped inside with it. It is a masterpiece of character study, a triumph of world building, and a profound, deeply moving exploration of the human condition. And that final shot, that quiet, hard-earned smile on Luna's face as she looks out at the sunrise, is a perfect, deeply earned ending that respects the emotional journey of the characters and leaves the audience feeling incredibly hopeful. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the past is, no matter how deep the trauma runs, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, of a new dawn, of a life lived on your own terms. It is a show that will stay with you long after the final credits roll, a show that will change the way you look at the genres it inhabits, and a show that will rightfully take its place as one of the greatest, most important dramas of our time. The morning of the seventh day breaks not with the triumphant, swelling orchestral fanfare you might expect from a season final, but with a suffocating, heavy silence that immediately sets your teeth on edge. The camera opens on a wide, static shot of the palace courtyard, bathed in the sickly, bruised plum twilight that filters through the stained glass of the high arches, casting long, distorted shadows across the frost-covered cobblestones. There is no wind. There are no birds. The ambient noise of the waking city is completely muted, replaced by the low, rhythmic, almost subsonic hum of the fracturing magical ley lines beneath the earth. It is a masterful use of audiovisual dissonance, creating a profound sense of dread that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Luna is standing in the center of the courtyard, dressed in the simplest, most unadorned linen shift she has worn since her regression. Her hair is unbraided, falling loosely around her shoulders, and her face is pale, drawn, and utterly exhausted. The physical toll of the previous 6 days of severing the soul tethers is written in the dark, bruised hollows under her eyes and the slight, persistent tremor in her hands. She looks less like a triumphant heroine who has successfully manipulated her way out of a toxic fate, and more like a survivor who has barely crawled out of a wreckage, bleeding and broken. And this visual choice is incredibly deliberate, because the showrunners are making a definitive statement right out of the gate. Surviving your trauma does not mean you emerge from it looking pristine and victorious. It leaves scars. It drains you. It changes the very architecture of your face. But you have to wonder, as you watch her standing there in the freezing morning air, what exactly she is expecting to happen when the 5 husbands finally arrive. Because the narrative tension at this point is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. The audience is caught in this agonizing push and pull between wanting her to achieve her ultimate goal of absolute freedom and being absolutely terrified of the magical and physical consequences of her untethering. When the first husband, the alpha, steps out of the shadows of the colonnade, the camera doesn't give us a dramatic, sweeping entrance. It just cuts to a medium shot of his boots hitting the frost, then pans up slowly to reveal his face. He has stripped away all of his ceremonial armor, all of the heavy, gilded pauldrons, and the high-collared cloaks that have defined his visual identity for the entire series. He is wearing a simple, dark tunic, and the vulnerability of that visual shading is staggering. He looks like a man walking to his own execution, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed entirely on Luna. He doesn't speak. He just walks over to her, stops exactly 3 paces away, a distance that clearly pains him to maintain, but one he knows she requires, and drops to one knee, bowing his head in absolute, unconditional submission. It is a breathtaking moment of visual storytelling, completely subverting the power dynamics of the entire series. The most powerful man in the realm, the stoic, untouchable alpha, is literally bringing himself down to the dirt, offering his neck, waiting for her to make the final cut. Now, this is where the show does something incredibly brave, and frankly, it is the moment that completely separated this series from every other regression fantasy on television. Because as the other 4 husbands emerge from the shadows and take their places in a semicircle around her, the narrative doesn't just have them beg for her forgiveness and then magically fix everything with a group hug. Instead, the show forces them to confront the actual, logistical, magical reality of what Luna has been doing. The second husband, the strategist, is the one who breaks the silence, and his voice is raspy, stripped of its usual smooth, calculating cadence. He explains, in agonizing, clinical detail, exactly what will happen if she severs the final, central anchor tether that connects all 5 of them to her. He tells her that the magical feedback won't just kill her, it will cause a catastrophic magical collapse that will wipe out the entire capital city. He isn't saying this to manipulate her. He isn't saying this to guilt-trip her. He is saying it because he has spent the last 6 days running the calculations, and he has found the one terrible, unavoidable truth. Her freedom literally requires the destruction of everything they have built. And this is where I have to offer a slightly contrarian take, because I know a lot of viewers online interpreted this scene as the husbands finally using logic to stop her from making a selfish mistake. But if you look closely at the micro-expressions of the actors, and if you pay attention to the underlying thematic subtext, it becomes painfully clear that the strategist isn't trying to save the city. He is trying to give her an out. He is essentially telling her, if you cut this last cord, you won't just be killing yourself, you will be killing millions of innocent people. We are giving you the mathematical proof that your revenge is too costly, so that you can choose to live without feeling like a monster. It is a profound, heartbreaking act of intellectual mercy. He is using his greatest skill, his brilliant, ruthless logic, not to trap her, but to absolve her of the guilt of staying. And this brings me to a deeply personal confession, something I haven't really talked about on this channel before, but watching this specific scene completely shattered my emotional defenses. I was sitting in my editing bay, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and as the strategist was laying out these cold, hard, devastating facts, I suddenly realized I was crying. Not just tearing up, but full-on, chest-heaving sobbing, because the show was holding up a mirror to my own life. For the past 5 years, I have been holding onto a massive, bitter grudge against a family member who betrayed my trust in a way that fundamentally altered my sense of security. I have spent years building these elaborate, logical arguments in my head about why I am justified in cutting them out of my life completely, why my emotional safety requires their absolute absence. But watching Luna stand there, realizing that her quest for absolute, untethered emotional safety was going to result in a catastrophic collateral damage that she couldn't live with, made me realize that my own walls weren't just keeping the pain out, they were suffocating me. The show didn't tell me to forgive my family member. It didn't give me a neat, tidy moral lesson. It just showed me the devastating, isolating cost of absolute emotional self-preservation, and it made me realize that sometimes choosing to stay in a messy, complicated, painful relationship is actually braver than walking away. It is a testament to the sheer, raw power of this writing that a high fantasy beast romance could make me re-evaluate my own real-life boundaries and trauma responses. If you think the emotional weight of that revelation is the climax of the episode, you are missing the bigger picture, because the actual magical ritual that follows is a visual and auditory masterpiece that will go down in television history. Luna makes a choice. She doesn't sever the final tether. Instead, she reaches out and grabs the glowing, fraying cord of light connecting her to the Alpha, and she pulls it into her own chest, absorbing the magical backlash rather than cutting it. The visual effects in this moment are absolutely staggering. The cord doesn't just snap, it dissolves into a blinding, liquid gold light that floods her veins, visible beneath her skin, tracing the path of a circulatory system in glowing, pulsing lines. The sound design drops out completely for a split second, creating a vacuum of silence, before hitting you with a massive, bass-heavy wave that rattles your speakers. The camera work here shifts to a dizzying 360-degree tracking shot that circles the five of them, moving faster and faster, blurring the background until the only things in focus are their faces and the blinding light of the merging tethers. The physical acting during this sequence is phenomenal. You can see the immense, agonizing physical strain on the actors as they channel their magical energy into her. The Alpha's veins bulge, the strategist's nose starts to bleed, the warrior's hands shake violently, the mystic's eyes roll back in his head, and the rogue lets out a raw, guttural scream of effort. It is a beautiful, terrifying depiction of shared burden. They are no longer just giving her their magic. They are taking her trauma, her pain, and her fractured soul, and they are absorbing it into themselves to stabilize the ley lines. But let me stop you right there, because while the visual spectacle of this ritual is undeniably gorgeous, the true brilliance of the scene lies in the quiet, devastating aftermath. Once the blinding light fades and the magical shockwave dissipates, the camera doesn't cut away to a wide shot of the stabilized city. It stays tight, intimately close on Luna's face. She is on her knees in the frost, gasping for air, her skin flushed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. The five husbands are scattered around her, equally exhausted, some still bleeding, some trembling. And then, the Alpha crawls over to her. He doesn't stand up. He doesn't try to pull her to her feet. He just stays on his knees in the frost, reaches out with a trembling, bloodied hand, and gently brushes a strand of hair out of her face. His touch is so incredibly light, so terrified of causing her even a fraction of a moment of discomfort that it completely breaks you. He looks into her eyes, and his voice is barely a whisper, cracked and raw, and he just says, "We are yours." Completely. Irrevocably. Do with us what you will. It is the ultimate surrender. They haven't just apologized, they have literally rewritten the magical and political laws of their world to make her the absolute, unquestioned sovereign of their life forces. The power dynamic hasn't just been balanced, it has been entirely inverted. And the look on Luna's face in response is a masterclass in complex emotional acting. She doesn't smile. She doesn't look triumphant. She just looks at him with a profound, overwhelming exhaustion, and then, slowly, she leans forward and rests her forehead against his. It is not a gesture of romantic passion. It is a gesture of mutual, shared survival. It is the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that they have all been through hell, and they're the only ones who can understand what the other has endured. Now, I know a lot of viewers found the political resolution in the final 20 minutes of the episode to be a bit rushed, and I completely understand why. After 6 episodes of incredibly intricate, slow-burn political maneuvering, having the High Council just accept the new magical paradigm, because the Alpha literally glows with the combined power of 5 beast lords, is a bit of a narrative shortcut. But if you look at the broader thematic context, it actually works perfectly. The show has never really been about the politics. The politics were just the cage that kept the characters trapped. The moment Luna absorbs the magical backlash and rewrites the tether system, the cage is broken. The Council's reaction is almost irrelevant because the fundamental source of their power, the subjugation of the human consorts, has been permanently dismantled. The show is telling us that when you fundamentally change the magical and emotional reality of a society, the political structures will naturally bend to accommodate it. It is a slightly fantastical, highly romanticized view of systemic change, but within the context of this specific narrative, it feels earned. The visual representation of this shift is also incredibly subtle but effective. In the final scenes of the council meeting, the camera angles have shifted. The council members are no longer shot from low angles looking up at the alpha. They are shot at eye level, and the alpha is flanked not by his generals, but by Luna and her 5 husbands standing as equals. The lighting in the council chamber has also changed from the harsh, cold, overhead fluorescence to a warm, diffused, natural light streaming through the newly opened windows. It is a visual cue that the sterile, oppressive era of the beast realms is over and a new, more balanced, more human era has begun. And speaking of visual cues, we have to talk about the costume design in the final scenes, because the evolution of the characters' wardrobes reaches its absolute peak in the epilogue. The heavy, restrictive, opulent fabrics of the early episodes are completely gone. The alpha is wearing a simple, dark, beautifully tailored tunic that allows him to move freely, with no armor, no heavy cloaks, no symbols of his absolute authority. The strategist is in a soft, open-collared shirt, his hair no longer perfectly styled, but falling naturally across his forehead. The warrior is in practical, worn leathers, looking less like a glorious general and more like a man who actually works the land. The mystic is in unadorned, simple linen, his spiritual authority no longer propped up by jewels and gold. And the rogue is in dark, flexible clothing, but the shadows that used to cling to him are gone, replaced by a relaxed, easy posture. And Luna, my God, Luna's final outfit is a masterpiece of character design. She is wearing a dress made of a soft, flowing, deep crimson fabric that moves beautifully with the wind. It is not the restrictive, corseted gown of her first life, nor is it the simple, practical linen shift of her regression. It is a perfect synthesis of her journey. It is beautiful, it is vibrant, but it is completely unrestrictive. She can move, she can breathe, she can run if she needs to. The color crimson is a brilliant choice, symbolizing not just passion and love, but also the blood she has shed, the life she has reclaimed, and the vitality that has returned to her body now that the magical tethers are healthy and balanced. She looks like a queen, not because she is wearing a crown, but because she carries herself with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who has faced her own death, stared down her own trauma, and chosen to live on her own terms. But let's shift our focus to the musical score during the epilogue, because the composer made a choice here that I initially found jarring, but which I now believe is an absolute stroke of genius. Instead of bringing back the sweeping, triumphant, full orchestra main theme, the final track is incredibly sparse. It is just a single, solitary cello, playing a slow, mournful, but ultimately resolving melody, accompanied by the very faint, almost imperceptible sound of a distant, rhythmic drumbeat. It is not a song of victory. It is a song of healing. Healing is not a triumphant, explosive event. It is a slow, quiet, often painful process of putting the pieces back together. The cello represents the deep, resonant, enduring nature of their bond, while the distant drumbeat represents the steady, ongoing pulse of their new life. As the camera pans across the 5 husbands, who are now working together in the palace gardens, literally tearing down the old, oppressive stone walls and planting new growth, the music swells just slightly, introducing a soft, warm string section that wraps around the cello melody. It is a beautiful, subtle musical representation of their individual traumas and their individual strengths weaving together to create something new and beautiful. And when the camera finally settles on Luna, who is standing on a balcony overlooking the gardens, the music doesn't crescendo into a massive, triumphant final. It just gently fades out, leaving the sound of the wind, the birds, and the distant, happy voices of the men below. It is a deeply grounded, incredibly human ending that refuses to give you a cheap, unearned emotional high, opting instead for a quiet, profound sense of peace. Now, I want to take a moment to really dig into the final conversation between Luna and the rogue, because it is the scene that completely recontextualizes the entire series and provides the ultimate thematic closure. The rogue is the only one who doesn't join the others in the garden. He stays behind with Luna on the balcony. Throughout the series, he has been the wild card, the one who operates in the shadows, the one who struggles the most with his own cowardice and his fear of abandonment. Their dynamic has always been the most fraught, the most playful, but also the most deeply scarred by his first timeline betrayal. As they stand there, looking out over the changing city, he is uncharacteristically quiet. He doesn't make a joke. He doesn't try to deflect with charm. He just looks at her, his eyes dark and serious, and he asks her the one question that has been hanging over the entire series. Are you happy? It is such a simple question, but the weight behind it is crushing. He isn't asking if she is satisfied with the political outcome or if she is glad the magical ley lines are stable. He is asking if the life she has chosen, the life she has fought so brutally to build, is actually making her happy. And Luna's response is what cements this show as an absolute masterpiece. She doesn't give a grand, sweeping monologue about love and destiny. She doesn't say, "Yes, I am finally happy." She just looks at him, a small, genuine, incredibly soft smile touching the corners of her mouth, and she says, "I am present." And for now, that is enough. That line, that single, perfectly crafted line of dialogue is the thesis statement of the entire series. It is the ultimate rejection of the regression fantasy trope. In most of these stories, the protagonist goes back in time to achieve a perfect, flawless, happily ever after. They fix every mistake, they get every guy, they achieve absolute, unshakable happiness. But Taming My Five Beast Husbands argues that absolute, unshakable happiness is a myth, especially for someone who has survived profound trauma. You don't get to go back and erase the pain. You don't get to achieve a perfect, flawless ending. What you get is the ability to be present. You get to wake up in the morning, feel the sun on your face, look at the flawed, complicated, deeply imperfect people you have chosen to love, and decide that being present in this exact moment is enough. It is a profoundly mature, deeply realistic, and incredibly beautiful philosophy of life. It acknowledges that trauma leaves a permanent mark, that there will always be bad days, that the shadows of the past will always linger. But it also asserts that you can still build a life that is worth living, a life filled with moments of genuine joy and connection, even if it isn't perfect. And the way the lead actress delivers that line, with such quiet, unassuming grace, completely destroys me every single time. It is the culmination of her entire character arc, from a terrified, traumatized girl running from her own memories, to a woman who has learned how to stand still, how to breathe, and how to just be. And this brings us to the final, lingering shot of the series, a shot that I have spent hours analyzing, and will probably spend the rest of my life thinking about. The camera pulls back slowly from Luna and the rogue on the balcony, rising higher and higher into the air, revealing the entire palace, the sprawling city, and the vast, untamed wilderness of the beast realms beyond. The color grading in this final wide shot is absolutely breathtaking. It is not the sterile, oppressive gold of her first life, and it is not the dark, bruised, traumatic purple of her regression. It is a vibrant, living, breathing palette of deep greens, rich earthy browns, and a sky that is a brilliant, clear, impossible blue. The sun is just starting to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the world, illuminating the new growth in the palace gardens, reflecting off the newly clean stone of the city walls. It is a visual representation of a new dawn, not just for Luna, but for the entire realm. The magical ley lines are stable, the political oppression is over, and the beast lords have finally learned how to be men. But as the camera continues to pull back, rising higher and higher into the clouds, the image slowly fades to black, and the screen goes completely dark. There is no post-credit scene. There is no tease for a second season. There is no hint that the story continues. The story is over. The journey is complete, and the silence that follows is profound, heavy, and incredibly satisfying. It is the silence of a story that has been told completely, perfectly, and without a single wasted note. Now, let's talk about the broader cultural impact of this final, because the reaction from the fandom was nothing short of explosive. When the episode dropped, the internet essentially broke. The trending topics were dominated by the show, the fan theories were going into overdrive, and the video essay community was churning out analysis at a record pace. But what was truly fascinating was the nature of the discourse. Usually, when a highly anticipated final drops, there is a massive divide in the fandom. Half the people love it, half the people hate it, and everyone is screaming at each other on social media. But with Taming My 5 Beast Husbands, the reaction was overwhelmingly, almost universally, one of profound emotional exhaustion and deep, resonant satisfaction. People weren't arguing about plot holes or character inconsistencies. They were sharing deeply personal stories about how the show had helped them process their own trauma, how it had changed the way they viewed their own relationships, and how it had given them the courage to confront their own pasts. The show had transcended the boundaries of entertainment and had become a genuine cultural touchstone for healing and emotional growth. It proved that fantasy romance, a genre that is often dismissed as lightweight, escapist fluff, has the power to tackle profound, complex, and deeply human themes in a way that resonates on a visceral, emotional level. It raised the bar for the entire genre, and it will be fascinating to see how other creators respond to the challenge it has set. But wait, there is one more layer to this final that I think a lot of people missed on their first watch, a subtle, brilliant piece of foreshadowing that completely recontextualizes the entire series. If you go back and watch the very first episode, the opening scene of Luna's death in the first timeline, there is a tiny, almost imperceptible detail in the background. As she is lying there, dying, the camera focuses on a small, intricate, carved wooden figurine sitting on the table next to her bed. It is a small, beautifully carved beast, a wolf, but its eyes are inlaid with a tiny, glowing piece of blue crystal. Now, fast forward to the final scene of the final, when Luna is standing on the balcony with the rogue. If you look closely at the table next to her, sitting in the morning sunlight is that exact same wooden wolf figurine. But the blue crystal in its eyes is gone, replaced by a warm, golden piece of umber. It is such a small, easily missed detail, but it is a massive, brilliant piece of visual storytelling. The blue crystal represented the cold, sterile, oppressive magic of the old regime, the magic that demanded her sacrifice. The umber represents the warm, living, balanced magic of the new regime, the magic that she has reclaimed and reshaped. It is a visual confirmation that the cycle has been broken, that the past has been acknowledged but not repeated, and that the world has fundamentally, irrevocably changed. It is the kind of meticulous, deeply thoughtful attention to detail that separates a good show from a truly great one. It shows that the showrunners planned this entire journey from the very first frame, and that every single choice, no matter how small, was made with purpose and intention. And this meticulous attention to detail extends to the acting as well, because the micro-expressions and the physical choices the actors make in the final episode are a masterclass in subtle, nuanced performance. Let's look at the alpha. Throughout the series, His physical posture has been incredibly rigid, his shoulders always pulled back, his chin always lifted, projecting an image of absolute, unshakable authority. But in the final scene, when he is working in the garden with the others, his posture is completely relaxed. His shoulders are down, his movements are fluid and easy, and there is a softness in his face that we have never seen before. He looks like a man who has finally put down a massive, crushing weight that he has been carrying for his entire life. The strategist, meanwhile, has stopped constantly analyzing his surroundings. In the early episodes, his eyes were always darting around, calculating, assessing threats, planning 3 steps ahead. But in the final, his gaze is soft, focused entirely on the task at hand or on Luna. He is finally allowing himself to just exist in the present moment without the constant, exhausting need to control every variable. The warrior has stopped clenching his fists. His hands, which were always tight, ready to strike, are now open, gently handling the delicate plants in the garden. It is a beautiful, physical manifestation of his transition from a weapon of war to a cultivator of life. The mystic is no longer floating above the ground, metaphorically and literally. He is grounded, his feet firmly planted in the dirt, his hands stained with soil, connecting with the physical world rather than just the spiritual one. And the rogue is no longer hiding in the shadows. He is standing in the direct sunlight, his face turned up to the sky, completely unafraid of being seen. The physical evolution of these 5 characters over the course of the series is a breathtaking display of ensemble acting, and it is a testament to the incredible direction and the deep, collaborative trust between the cast and the crew. Now, let's talk about the thematic resonance of the show's ending, specifically its exploration of the concept of taming. The title of the show is Taming My 5 Beast Husbands, and for the entire series, the audience is led to believe that the beasts are the husbands, and that Luna's journey is about taming them, about breaking their wild, dangerous nature and forcing them to submit to her will. But the final reveals that the true meaning of the title is much more profound, much more complex. The beasts are not just the husbands. The beasts are the trauma, the grief, the anger, the fear, and the societal expectations that have trapped all of them. Luna's journey wasn't just about taming 5 dangerous men. It was about taming the beasts inside herself, the beasts inside the realm, and the beasts of the past. And the husbands, in their own flawed, messy, desperate ways, were the ones helping her do it. They were the mirrors that reflected her pain back at her, forcing her to confront it, to process it, and eventually to let it go. The true taming was not an act of domination. It was an act of mutual healing. It was the process of taking the wild, untamed, destructive forces of their past and shaping them into something nurturing, something balanced, something beautiful. It is a brilliant, feminist reclamation of the concept of taming, transforming it from a narrative of subjugation into a narrative of partnership, growth, and mutual respect. It is a message that resonates deeply, not just within the context of the fantasy genre, but in the real world as well, reminding us that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about having the courage to confront our own inner demons and work with others to build a better, more balanced life. And as we look at the legacy of Taming My 5 Beast Husbands, it is clear that it is going to be remembered as a landmark achievement in television storytelling. It is a show that took the familiar, well-worn tropes of the regression and reverse harem genres and injected them with a level of psychological depth, emotional honesty, and visual artistry that is incredibly rare. It challenged its audience, it broke their hearts, and then it painstakingly, beautifully put them back together. It is a show about the devastating cost of trauma, the complicated, non-linear nature of forgiveness, and the radical, terrifying act of choosing to love again after you have been destroyed. It is a show that asks us to look at the monsters we create, the systems we build, and the walls we put up to protect ourselves. And it asks us if those walls are actually keeping the pain out, or if they are just keeping us trapped inside with it. It is a masterpiece of character study, a triumph of world building, and a profound, deeply moving exploration of the human condition. And that final shot, that quiet, hard-earned smile on Luna's face as she looks out at the sunrise, is a perfect, deeply earned ending that respects the emotional journey of the characters and leaves the audience feeling incredibly hopeful. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the past is, no matter how deep the trauma runs, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, of a new dawn, of a life lived on your own terms. So, what is my final verdict on Taming My Five Beast Husbands? It is, without a single doubt, an absolute, unmitigated masterpiece. It is a 10 out of 10 flawless, breathtaking piece of television that sets a new gold standard for the fantasy romance genre. It is a show that demands your full attention, that rewards your emotional investment, and that will stay with you long after the final credits roll. If you are a fan of the regression trope, if you love complex, deeply flawed characters, if you appreciate stunning visual artistry, or if you just want to watch a show that will make you feel every single emotion in the human spectrum, you need to watch this show immediately. It is not just entertainment, it is an experience. It is a journey that will challenge you, break you, and ultimately heal you. For the newcomers, it is a perfect entry point into the genre, offering a fresh, mature, and deeply psychological take on the familiar tropes. For the fans, it is a love letter that respects the source material while elevating it to heights you never thought possible. And for the critics, it is a masterclass in storytelling, a show that proves that genre fiction can be just as profound, just as complex, and just as artistically valid as any prestige drama on television. And that is all the time we have for this massive, deep dive review on Flick Flair. I cannot thank you enough for sticking with me through this incredibly long, incredibly emotional breakdown. If you enjoyed this review, if it resonated with you, or if it just made you want to rewatch the show, please, I cannot stress it enough, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let me know in the comments what your favorite moment from the final was, or how the show's themes of trauma and healing impacted you personally. I read every single comment, and I love discussing the nuances of these shows with you guys. It is your support that allows me to keep making these deep, unfiltered reviews. Until next time, keep watching, keep analyzing, and keep flaying the fiction.